Hey everyone, I'm Tony from the Handlebar Workshops, and today we're in the garage workshop. This is episode 6 of the mortise chair build. We're going to be building the slats that go under the armrests, between the bottom of the chair and the armrests. Again, this is the tutorial how-to build. If you're looking for something a little bit more general, a bit more of an overview, I'll be posting that once the chairs are done and all of these videos have been put out. So if you're looking for that in the future, look below to see if the links are there for that. So let's get on with the build. So this is the bottom rail of the side of the chair. I'm going to put slats that go up to the top rail. You can start with either the bottom or the top. I'm choosing the bottom here. The problem comes in is that it's difficult to measure this distance and split it up evenly. Best method I've found is to take a piece of painter's tape and then mark the ends. I can lay this tape down on a flat piece like my bench here. I've got a nice easy way to measure between the lines. So using some of the back of the envelope math, I was able to come up with some spacing here which made everything nice and even. Transfer that to the piece itself, and I marked out where the slats will come in. The black is the shoulder and the red is where the tenon is going to go in, so I got to cut out a mortise in all these red spots. These mortises are all a 1/2 inch. Notice that that 1/2 inch mortise is the same as my mortising chisel here, as is my up spiral bit, router bit. So I can get in there. The problem is that not so much here, but on the top side I'm going to have to route in that curve, so I'm going to have to use my little handheld. I also have a 1/2 inch bit for that as well. And I made it easy on myself to lay everything out where I could use the calipers to come up with my first mortise point. Then I can use the dividers to get my next mortise, and the next mortise, and the next mortise. And I can use the depth finder here, the gauge here, to get the sides of the mortises. Then I can do everything the other way as well. So now I just got to lay it out on all the other ones. So now I need to transfer the mortise positions from the bottom rail to the top rail. I've got everything clamped up in the cauls, and it's pretty much in the right position it's going to be in once it's all done and sitting on the floor. I'm going to be using a drywall T-square to transfer everything up. I'm using the black and red one that I was using before, so I got to make sure I only transfer the red lines to the top up here. Alright, now as a bit of a double check, I've got the calipers set to the length of my mortise, and I've got the dividers set to the distance between the mortises. Using the calipers, I'm going to make a mark at the end of the mortise here. Then using the dividers, I make a mark at the beginning of my next mortise, and then that's the length of my mortise there. There we go, and they pretty much line up with my marks. But this way, since I know I'm going to have straight slats, I need to make sure that everything is the same width. So now my marks I can bring over the mortise edges here. And then I can mark these the same width here. I need to figure out how long to cut the pieces of wood that are going to be going in here. We're going to be going 3/4 inches in on each side, so that's an extra 1.5 inches. This should be our shortest piece here, which is going to be about 11 inches. I've got the marks up here from before, so I can line that up. And that's right about 11 inches there. And then down over here, about 11 3/4. So 11 3/4 plus 1.5 inches. I just go 2 and go 13 3/4. So now I can plane this down and start cutting it up into the sizes I need. This width is not exactly 2 inches. So to set up the table saw, we're going to use the calipers using the points we set before. Lock down the calipers. We'll use these pins up here to set the distance from the blade. Now I just need to use my mortise chisel and square these up. You may have noticed I use 2 different routers when cutting the mortises on top of these rails. I prefer to use the bigger router with the spiral cut bit in it, because that plows right through the wood and removes the mortise nice and easy. And while that works fine for the convex portion of this rail here, it doesn't work so well for the concave portion of this one. You can see there's a gap down here that I can easily put my finger into. What I ended up doing was using the smaller router with a much smaller base on it, and that could get right in here and stay nice and tight up against the wood here, which is much safer, and I can get a better cut that way. And I didn't want to use this router for the other rails because you can see I was already burning this bit up pretty good, just trying to get it through all these mortises on these concave pieces here. So using the other bit was much easier, as well as using a much bigger router, the motor, more horsepower. I need to find the center of the mortises so I can mark the position of the drawbore pin. And I can drill the holes for the drawbore pegs. I'm using the same size drill and pegs as I use on the legs. I'm using a backer board to prevent chip out on the exit side, and I'm drilling from the inside in case there is any chip out on the inside. It's much easier to hide. To start the tenon, I'm going to run one end of the slat over the router, 1/8 of an inch high, all the way around the slat. I need to start shaping the tenons to match the curves of the rails here. I want to minimize the gaps as much as possible. Now that said, since it'll be viewed from the top, I can have some gaps up along here and it won't be too visible. But in order to give myself every possible advantage, I need to sand first, because as I sand, it's going to be removing wood and making this wider. We need to measure and mark the depths of the mortises so we know how long to make those slats. I know this may seem like sacrilege, marking up a freshly sanded edge, but we'll need marks at the front of each mortise so we know where the fronts of the slats will go. Line up the bottom of the slat with the line I made for the mortise depth. Now, keeping the alignment on the bottom, I align the top front of the slat with the line I made on the top rail. I make sure that the back of my tenon isn't sticking out. And then I mark all the corners with the marking knife. And here I've laid out the slats, starting with some nice straight grain in the center and moving towards more crazy grain as it moves out. So this will be for this side of the chair, and that side will be for the other side of the chair. So we'll move these out of the way and work with these. So I developed a bit of a numbering system. Any side of the chair that has a 1 on it will have either a 1 or 3 as the first number on the slats, 1 being one side, 3 being the other side. And any chair that has 2 will have 2 or 4. We'll start with 1 at the front of the chair and 6 at the back of the chair. So this will be 31, and we'll number it through 36. And obviously these are the insides of the slats. That's going to be the outside. And using a square, I can pull a line across the edge of the rail, And that denotes the shoulder where it will meet the side of the rail. You notice I have the side up on 2x4s and 2 rails here. So that keeps this from hitting the bottom here and making things all kind of wonky. I'm resting solely on these 2 rails. That gives me a nice solid platform to work on. I line up the marks on the edges of the slats with the marks I put on top of the rails, and then I use the knife to follow the curve of the rail. You can see how the line on the edge matches up with the line on the face that follows the curve, and the same thing on this side, and the same thing on the bottom. So now I'm going to remove the wood up to these lines here to make that tenon. I'm going to put the chisel in the knife line, give it a good hard whack. And then just keep moving on down that line. Curve is so gentle enough where a 1/2 inch, actually this is a 1 inch chisel, works just fine. Now that I have my line pretty much defined, I can go in there and give it some harder whacks. I'm not going to put my chisel flat on the tenon just yet because if I whack it in there, this line doesn't go all the way down. So there's a good chance I can get into the grain and lift this whole thing up all the way back here. So I'm going to kind of keep it up a little bit higher and just give it a soft tap. It comes right off. Now I can go give some more whacks right on the shoulder here. Now I can start going onto the tenon wall here. And now I'm just going in with no hammer or no mallet. I'm just going to start shaving off a little bit of thickness there. I've got a nice smooth tenon right there. I just got to do the other side and the edges. This is too long. This isn't quite 1/3 of an inch, so as far as length and width, we look to be pretty good. So let me just cut off this. So now all it has is kind of weird rounded look to it. This is the inside. You can tell because of the tape. All right, so there's a bit of a gap here. Yeah, I got a nice tight gap there. And that's the outside of the chair. I just got a whole bunch more to do. And I got to do the tops. You can see the lines here. So now we need to start working on these top dados to go into the top rail. I've already got one done. Let me show you how I do it. Remember that we've already marked all these using the rail before. So we've got the basic marks, but they're so much longer than what we need them to be. Using this line as a reference, I'm going to strike another line 3/4 of an inch past that, because that's how deep our mortises are. Again, this ruler is 3/4 of an inch wide, so I can just lay it there and strike the line. Now there is a slight curve to this one, but not much. It's fairly straight at this point, so that will be all right there. And we could also trim up some of that as well to make it match. We're going to have to, in fact. It's a bit hard to see, but the line is right there. I'm going to cut it on the bandsaw here. Now we don't want this to be exactly 3/4 of an inch because our mortises are 3/4 of an inch, so we want it slightly smaller. So I cut right down the center of that 3/4 inch mark. I have my gauge set to 1/8 of an inch. So taking off 1/8 of an inch all the way around will leave me with a nice 1/2 inch tenon here. I'm going to mark these lines with a red pen because with the saw curves here, it's hard to see where exactly those lines are at. I'm using a double-edged Ryoba here. One edge has much smaller teeth for cross-cutting and much larger teeth for rip cutting. I'm actually going to start with the cross-cutting teeth, even though I'll be ripping down with the grain over here. But just to get me started, I'll be using the smaller teeth because it cuts a little easier to start with. And then I'll flip it over and use the bigger teeth. When you use your thumb to start a cut, you're going to keep it so that the fat part of your thumb is touching the blade, but the teeth are kind of coming off so that that's not the part that's touching your finger. Because otherwise you will scratch up your thumb pretty good. Now I can flip over and start using the rip blade. Now I use a small cross-cutting Japanese saw to cut off the tabs here. Now I'm going to mark the long ways here. Start with the top up here. So now we get to see how well it fits. The numbers on the inside, there's no tape over here, so this is the outside. One of the problems we have with these mortises is that they're not exactly straight up and down in this direction here. So what I usually end up doing is rounding off the ends of the tenon, so it goes in there nice and tight. So back to the bandsaw. This is the outside here, so we got to make sure there's no gaps. And you can see there's a bit of a gap there. Not exactly sure what's causing that. The inside here is nice and tight, so I probably need to take some off of this side to close up the gap on this side. So this is the inside with the numbers, so I got to take off a little bit on this side here. So we're almost there. We've got the armrests, we've got everything put together, got the slats in here. I gotta mark the holes for the draw bores. So before we do any routing for the corbels, we need to do some order of operations here. I need to take it apart, hopefully for the last time. At that point I'll sand it down, and then when I put everything together I'll glue it up and put it in the draw bores. So we got to take all these pieces of tape off, but we got to keep our joints marked so everything goes together properly. And then I also have to mark the draw bores on in the holes there. So I'm going to use the same drill bit I used to drill these holes, and it's got a brad point tip on there so I can make a nice mark on the wood in each of the holes. So this is the bottom rail, joint 1E. These are the two marks that I made with the brad point bit. I marked them in red so you can see them easier on camera. I'm going to go about a 1/16 of an inch or so closer to the shoulder of the tenon. And that's where we'll drill our holes to put the draw bores in. Now since this is 1E, we're going to be taking this off so we can do some sanding. I'm going to mark it between these holes. That won't get sanded off. Then we can remove the tape. There's a little bit of a lighter mark where that tape was. After the sanding, you won't be able to see that. And for the slats that have the number written on them, that's going to get sanded off. So I can go up to the top, and I know my hole's going to be right around there, so if I come over here, I can write the number in here, in this case 32, and this marks both the inside of the slat and the top of the slat. And then finally, For the mortises here, this is marked as 1F. I can write that on the inside. Then I can remove this piece of tape for sanding. First I sanded with 80 grit paper to remove a bunch of the tooling marks and any marks left over from glue and whatnot. Then I went on to 120, and I used the 120 to kind of break the corners a bit so they weren't so harsh and you wouldn't splinter as easily. It'd feel nicer if you rubbed up against them. Finally I finished with 220. Well, that's it for our Slats episode here. Be sure to give me a thumbs up if you like this one. And think about subscribing, because the next one is for corbels, which is another essential design feature of the arts and crafts and craftsman style. So be sure to check that out. And if you hit the subscribe button down below, you'll be notified when that comes out. So thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.